Welcome everyone. This is Visioning the Future Artistic Doctorates in Ireland, our seminar series. My name is Jules Gilson. I'm Professor of Creative Practice at University College Cork in Ireland, and I'm leading this research project along with colleagues across Ireland and at University College Cork as well. This morning I'm delighted to welcome us back from our 2-week holidays, and we have a session this morning from Vida Midgelow, and the session is called Looking Forward, Artistic Doctorates in Dance and Movement Practices. And the session this morning is going to be chaired by our colleague Jenny Roach, who is the acting course director of the PhD in Arts Practice and director of the MA in Contemporary Dance Performance at the Irish World Academy of Music and Dance at the University of Limerick. So Jenny, I'll pass over to you now. Thank you.
Hi Jules, thanks so much. I'm delighted to be asked to chair the session today and to introduce our guest speaker. I'm just going to give a brief bio before asking Vida to speak. So Vida is Professor in Dance and Choreographic Practices at Middlesex University, where she leads the research degree provision for the Faculty of Arts and Creative Industries. As an artist scholar, she works on practices research methodologies, improvisation and articulation processes, and has published widely in these areas, including the Oxford Handbook of Improvisation in Dance, an extensive collection of new writing. Her most recent performance work, Breathbone, was premiered at Not Dance. The practice invites entry to the felt sense, and its sister work will work with non-specialist performers, further merging performer-participant experiences. Her work supporting artist researchers led Vida and her long-term collaborator Jane Bacon to develop the creative articulation process, a process that supports the creative process and coming to language in and through practice. Vida has co-edited the hybrid peer-reviewed journal Choreographic Practices for 10 years and is the director of the Erasmus Plus funded Artistic Doctorates in Europe project. It is this project that she will be speaking about in her presentation today. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Vida to come on. Thank you, and looking forward to it.
Thank you, Jenny. So good morning, everybody. It is really great to be here and be part of this series. The doctoral education and the nature of artistic doctorates in particular is a very particular interest of mine that kind of draws together a range of my research interests around methodologies, but also then what are we doing in terms of articulation of practice and how does that work find its way into the doctoral field. Michael, if we just go to the first slide. Thank you very much. So today I'm just going to share some thoughts with you about artistic research or practices research. I'm not going to dwell too much on those differences, but to use them as synergist words, even though they are quite different in different countries. And then introduce you to the artistic doctorates in your project. From that, sharing some survey findings and particularly the recommendations for action that came toward the end of that project. But perhaps before I do that, it might be interesting just to share with you my own personal experience of doctoral education with my own doctoral education. So I started my PhD in the mid-90s, before we really had practices research established and before the influential practices research in performance project that led towards a framing of recommendations for regulatory structures for doctoral education in the UK that included practice. My own PhD, though, was a traditional 80,000 word thesis, but for which I made a series of choreographies, but I discussed them, and it was the writing of them that was assessed rather than the practice itself. And indeed, I don't really remember discussing in my supervision the practice at all, other than what I said about it in the writing. So it was quite a different experience, quite a different time for where we were in the beginning of practices research. And when I look at the thesis, I now look at it, which I don't do very often, but for preparing for this, I had another look. And it takes quite a zoomed out, quite objectifying approach about the practice. It was developed during a time when dance studies was really focused on sort of post-structuralist dance analysis, and it applies a feminist intertextual approach. And it looks at both my own work and the work by others through that same lens, as an analysis of an object, rather than in any way engaging with the creative process or articulating the methods for the research, or the methods for the practice of the research. And so I read it and I think it kind of misses, in lots of ways, really speaking from the movement, from the creative process, and articulating what was going on within that, the research methods in the studio. And I think it's probably this lack that I recognised in that earlier work that I've probably been working through with my own candidates and thinking about in terms of what do we understand by practice as research in the doctoral frame ever since. And so what I'm kind of be interested in, you'll hear as we talk, as I go through this talk, is something about how within the doctorate does the practice really speak? How do we find language for it, but also how it in itself is it the research? How does it actually manifest the research questions? And how then, as supervisors and candidates, do we work together to really focus on what is going on within that practice work, and how does it find a manifestation in the world? So if we just go to the next slide. Great. So as I say, I'm not going to worry too much about the definitions, whether it's practice research, artistic research, practice research, or performance as research. These terms have been used quite differently across different countries and have different histories to them. But what is really important to me, and in the things I'll be talking about today, is that the practice forms the core modality of the investigation. And that practice also is a key part of the dissemination and assessment of the research. And so that for me is sort of a kind of defining feature, whatever we want to call it, that the practice is forming that core of the investigation, but also the mode of assessment, mode of dissemination, making visible itself the research. So, but quickly to open up, and I'm not going to dwell on these because we don't have time, but if we think about what might be the features of movement-based practices research, core things for me are that it's a corpo-materially discursive research process, that it is motional, and particularly that it is in skills. We are working from an embodied practice, and we are taking this into a discursive material process. Core to that is about really understanding the situation we are in, the situatedness of the research for both ourselves as the researcher and the research we are undertaking. We might otherwise talk about that as by your kind of knowing your field, situating and contextualizing yourself in the field might be another way to talk about it. And that's a sort of key responsibility of the researcher. And the whole process requires a very high level of reflexivity about your own processes and how those relate to the processes of others and the thinking and practices of others. So researchers are then often combining creative processes with other kinds of methodologies. And we tend towards, in practices research, what we might call processual or emergent methods. And I'm particularly interested in methods where we're trying to find findings from within the practice, rather than focusing on questions that are about the creative work. So my own PhD, as I said, was really looking at my own practice in an about mode. And what I've been interested in really is how do we work from within the practice to give rise to our questions, to give rise to our methodologies, and what does that then look like for us? So in doing so, we're really taking movement and choreographic practice beyond thinking about kind of production protocols or the specific established movement languages, or even really thinking about movement languages in that way, to think about movement practice as an epistemic practice that is about producing knowledge, and it might find many modes of articulation in the world. So it might be a choreographic outcome, but it might be many other kinds of outcome that come through that creative process. Next slide, please. Great. So if we're thinking about what creative practice, what practices research can do in movement, for me, one of the things that we're doing as a first step is making a difference to the field of dance, to the field of choreography. And within that, we're also starting to shift what our perceptions are of choreography and what our perceptions are of the academic domain. So we are challenging both of those domains, what it means to be working in dance practice and what it means to be an academic. And so we're really engaging, sort of, as Jonathan Burrows says, rewriting the parameters of what it may mean to be visible within the dance field. So what does that, how does the practice, how does research challenge our whole notion of what it means to be working in a choreographic mode? So sort of a first step, we're making a difference to the field of dance. But we're also making a difference potentially to creatively address and connect and to transform society more widely, to think about through practice, how do we engage with communities, how do we engage and think about those sort of broad global problems that we face, and that practice research can do that just as successfully and perhaps more successfully than many other fields. So it's not just about this kind of, what we might say, this sort of self-reflexive bubble of practice research where we're thinking about our own practice, but we're also reaching out to make a difference to others. And that this process then is one that involves a sort of moving into the unknown or the not yet known, and working within a process of being comfortable with a certain level of uncertainty. And that in research terms is both really exciting, but also perhaps means that given that practice research is perhaps both historically less established, but also perhaps as resistant, and I think usefully having kind of pre-established guidelines in which what make it, you know, what are the methods we should follow. We're working to create our own paths, to invent the methods that we use even as we go along that path. And that for me is a really exciting place to be within the doctorate, but also obviously perhaps a scary one. There's a sort of a tendency to want to reach towards known methodologies that we can perhaps fix down more quickly, whereas actually working within practice research is perhaps a, as I said earlier, a more kind of emergent process, and we have to kind of trust that process and go with that process within our research. And that is sometimes difficult within the frameworks of doctoral programs, and we can talk about that as we go forward. Next slide, please. So it is those kind of questions about how do we support doctoral researchers, how do we really advance the field of doctoral research, that was the focus of the Artistic Doctorates in Europe project. In its first phase, its first 3 years, was funded by an Erasmus Plus grant and pulled together 8 partners from across the UK, Sweden and Finland, and also mixed together partners that were from universities and from the professional dance field. And that synergy across the professional practice field and the academia felt to us as researchers really important in terms of reflecting the hybrid identities that a lot of doctoral research students come with and want to continue in their career. So it's this sort of synergy across those two sectors. And it's also just worth pointing out here that we used throughout the project the notion of the artistic doctorate, but we used it to point toward artistic research degrees that might be called a Doctor of Philosophy, the PhD, including practice, or it might be called a Doctor of Arts or other versions of that. And again, whilst there are debates around the difference between those things, for us, the core thing that was practice was at the core of whatever the degree was, and that it was at that higher doctoral level. Because of course, regulations in each institution define the differences between those two, and sometimes the Doctor of Arts and the Doctor of Philosophy are very similar, sometimes they're hugely different programs in terms of the way they're structured. but we use the term artistic doctorate. It's also the term that was used by our Scandinavian partners most strongly, and it reflected their history and development of this field. So this project then sought to really investigate and make a change within doctoral research programs, and we were very interested to make sure that, as I said, we were working both with our professional dance partners, but also recognizing that students and their supervisors and the experience of everybody in that mix was part of the debate, rather than the tendency to think about candidates over here, supervisors over here, and to sort of silo those relationships. It was about sort of really bringing those experiences together to investigate the whole of the research journey. Next slide, please. Great. So the project led to a raft of events. We held both research intensives focused towards candidates, as well as undertook a lot of public events that focused towards thinking about what are the perceptions of the artistic doctorate, and bringing our cultural sector partners into dialogue with us, and led to a collection of both written and recorded documents that are all available online and open access. The core ones I'm going to talk about today are the first one. I'm just going to briefly give you some findings from the survey we undertook in the very beginning of the project, and then really talk about the recommendations for action that ended the funded phase of the Erasmus funded phase of the project. But all of that work is available online, and I invite you to go investigate it. Take it on in your programs. If you're a candidate, the resource in As Motion is a great collection of how to really get involved with the nitty-gritty of the doings of doctoral study. Next slide, please. So the survey that we undertook 3 surveys that were focused on those different kind of stakeholders, for want of a better word. We had a survey for candidates themselves, for supervisors and the people delivering doctoral programs, and for the cultural sector. And there was a lot of synergy, a lot of similarities across the 3 surveys. We've deliberately designed them such that they were asking similar, even if slightly differently slanted questions. And the survey, we had about 185 responses to the survey from those different groups. And actually people took an awful amount of time. The level of commitment to completing the survey and the level of textual information that came out of it was really rich. So, but key things that came out then were that there was a mixed quality and confidence both in supervision and by supervisors of how to support this kind of work. That there's a frustration in terms of the readiness of the academy by artist researchers to really understand and appreciate and support the implications of artistic research and the processes and facilities and procedures that it meant undertaking. So in that, there was a kind of recognition of an ongoing tension between artistic research processes and what were conventional academic approaches, and candidates and their supervisors still struggling to work out how to manage those tensions that were systemic within the design of programs and the design of university assessment processes. A sense of isolation, particularly for supervisors, but also for those candidates who were working within programs where they were perhaps the only artistic researcher and perhaps the only dance researcher in that area. And a desire for better cross-sector working, really wanting to bring the gap between artistic research and audiences and between professional organisations and artistic researchers together more fully, to make a more meaningful connection between what we might see as the kind of the audience, what was seen or perceived as the audience-facing nature of professional practice, and perhaps the research-facing nature of the artistic doctorate and wanting those things to have more synergy, such that the impact of the research going on within doctoral frames could actually have reach more people and have more impact. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to briefly talk then about some of the recommendations that came out of the Erasmus funded phase of the project. And these are available in a selection of languages and were designed really as kind of prompts for candidates to look at, well, what might it be I'm looking for in a program if I'm entering, or for programs to think about, well, what is it that I might want to put into a program if I'm to offer a rich and holistic experience for candidates, and for supervisors to think about how am I engaging with my candidates and supporting my candidates to the best of my ability. So it is both policy focused, regulation focused, and candidate focused in a number of ways. Next slide, please. So the recommendations then come in 4 areas, really thinking about doctoral training in the education and what it might look like, remembering that across countries, the model of education is quite different, where there are some where it's credit bearing and that you're engaging in doctoral education with a credit bearing element. Speaking from the UK context, that where the doctoral program doesn't have credits, but we are still really developing seminar and training processes that are generally an optional or part of a program rather than credit bearing. Really thinking about supporting supervisors and examining processes. What might we need to improve infrastructures and environments for this work to take place, with as a particular emphasis on the relationship, what might be possible for cross-sector collaboration, thinking about how this work connects the university and the professional dance sector, and how we might enhance and support doctoral programs and doctoral candidates to make a difference with their research, and how might they reach to participate beyond their own program, beyond their own research, to make a difference to others. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to speak about 3 of these areas. So really thinking about doctoral education and how we ensure that we're increasing access to those programs, talk a bit more about supervisory processes, and then just very briefly touch on the recommendation to reach further beyond the program to participate in world issues. So I'm just going to touch on each of these areas briefly. Next slide, please. So even before we had the police killing of George Floyd, this was a core question for us through the programme of how, if we take for a basis that artistic research can celebrate non-normative ways of knowing, and that it should be a place that to really be fully diverse and inclusive in nature, we recognised the difficulties and the lack of diversity within our sector. And it seemed to us we were struggling both from a lack of diversity within the arts field and the lack of diversity we were seeing within the doctoral programs themselves. And somehow that became a kind of double whammy, for want of a better description, for doctoral programs in artistic research. And so we're proposing that we really need to take concrete actions to transform both the organisations, to really think about how do we rethink doctoral education, to dismantle what we're seeing as a kind of white supremacy and a systemic whiteness in artistic research, and to really think about how do we challenge those constructions that are limiting who has access and what kind of work gets undertaken within doctoral programs. So that leads to questions about well, which practices and which epistemologies are valued? How do programs, even on a more practical level, where are they communicated? Who thinks that it's suitable for them? And is that part of our communication strategies? So that might mean we have to re-look at our entry policies. What are our competitive selection processes, and what does that mean if we're to become a more diverse and inclusive field? So if we're competing for funding, and it always says you have to have a first, a distinction in your master's degree, that is already limiting the number of people that can come into our programs. So what are we looking for in our entries, and how far are we really challenging our unconscious bias in those processes, but also in the actual, even the basic design of those entry processes? How much do the content and the modalities, the research support and training really meet the diverse needs and very different backgrounds of the candidates we want to include and encourage in our programs? And how open really is our field to an expanded and fully inclusive approach to artistic research practice? So some sort of questions that are really difficult to answer, but important to ask of ourselves in relationship to our programs, to look at how are our own systems and structures really meeting diverse needs, and encouraging and being open to a very broad range of practice, a very broad range of approaches to research. And I just point you very briefly to there's some writing from Gabang, who asks, this is from the Researching in Osmotion research collection, open access online, and she asks 10 things to consider if you're a person of colour entering an academic institution. And I invite you to go and see the things she asks you to consider. It's a really interesting list to challenge our thinking. Next slide, please. So a core part of the research experience for candidates is based in supervision. Now, that is the core experience for most candidates, is working with their supervisors. And how does that experience and relationship work? And one of the key things we felt is really necessary to challenge, well, what do we mean by supervision? Those two ideas, that super gives us a hierarchical structure, and vision work based on some kind of ocular sensory process. And in challenging both of those notions, what might it mean to enter a research process with supervisor and candidate, thinking about it as a creative, maybe somatic and a skilled process, and that is something that invades the whole of the research process. It's not something the candidate just does in the studio, but actually, what is the nature of thinking about the supervisory process itself as a somatic or improvisatory or witnessing practice? What is it to think about in supervision as a choreographic process, and to enter into the feedback and discussion processes as a creative activity, rather than one that takes place generally, we found through our surveys, in offices or in cafes, and is one that is still embedded in the use of track change functions, rather than one that really is deeply ingrained through a process of creative knowing and from a sort of embodied understanding. So these kind of questions of what happens if we foreground allowing, attuning, waiting, non-doing, listening, improvising as a supervisory exchange. What happens if we make space for meta-reflection on the experiencing that is going on within the research journey? What happens if we reconfigure supervision as a witnessing practice, as a mindful practice, rather than leaping so quickly, and I'm as guilty as this as anybody, to the critical model of supervision, where we're engaged in giving quick criticisms and corrections rather than fully embedding ourselves in the experience of the process together. So just really thinking about how do we reshape the supervisory experience as a shared space between us. And in the publication, reconsidering, so down at the bottom of the slide, reconsidering research and supervision as creative embodied practice that Jane Bacon and I co-wrote. We offer in there a collection of kind of strategies and ideas for ways that you might activate embodied processes within the supervisory experience. And that has got lots of lovely examples and ideas from both candidates and supervisors from across mainly the UK and Scandinavian countries, but also some from beyond that I really welcome you to try out and let me know how they work. Next slide, please. So core to that really thinking about supervision is that we really start to move beyond the tendency to have this kind of fairly hermetically sealed supervisor model. And so even though most candidates are probably now working with at least 2 supervisors, and so they're getting that experience. But what does it mean to think about that rather than as this kind of one hierarchical relationship that I mentioned earlier? It's not a super process, but thinking of it as a collective effort. As we see here, the notion of it being an alliance, the thing about developing a collective institutional responsibility to create the candidate to be more agile in their experience, such that we're, rather than thinking about it as being something that candidates enter into this kind of hierarchical relationship, they're actually in some kind of collective or co-relational, co-generative process. And that process beyond the supervisor-supervisee model is one that's networked and relational, both with other colleagues and with other candidates, both within their institution and beyond. And how do we build and make those networks and help those networks happen such that we're entering into different kinds of spaces with our research? So this notion of entering into partnerships or third spaces, spaces that are neither solely belonging to the academy or solely belonging to candidates or solely belonging to professional practice, and really thinking about how do we promote research and communities and networks across those different locations to really support this idea that the undertaking of a research degree is one that, as Bell Hooks would say, is a collective effort. Next slide, please. So just briefly, because it's not possible to speak about the forwardness of artistic research, and particularly artistic research in movement practice, without really noticing the difficulties and challenges that COVID has wrought, and as we think forward, continues to change how we think. So a lot of the processes that are really articulated in terms of artistic research in movement are key around collaboration, embodiment, being together with people in participatory and experiential exchanges, being really key to the kind of artistic research movement researchers are undertaking. And those things have been really tricky in this through the whole of lockdown, but also as we go forward, and as our sort of ability to touch and exchange in the ways that we might previously have done become challenged. As we first went into the very sort of hard end of lockdown, one of the things that we did was run a Zoom call thinking about what were the challenges facing us and how we were moving to some kind of online distance learning kind of model. And I think perhaps one of the things that's been really exciting coming out of it, rather than only focusing on the negative and the difficulty, is that this real enhancement within our universities and within supervisory forces to focus on well-being, to focus on the development of communities, and to focus on kind of how do we really work together but it gives rise to questions too, of more questions around access and equity for our candidates, as well as questions around how do we go forward in supporting creative practice at a distance. My own candidates certainly are, we're now in that phase of negotiating. How do we return to spaces? How do we return to using all the sort of specialist equipment and technical support they might need? So these are still ongoing challenges for us that I think have really hit our field and artists across the world actually hard, and we need to continue to be attentive to. Next slide, please. So finally, despite the difficulties that I'm sort of addressing and the challenges that we face, well, the last recommendation of the ADIE recommendations for actions is that we support candidates to boldly implement their research to the benefit of others. That we're really interested in challenging and thinking about how does artistic research address communities, how do we face transdisciplinary issues and address societal concerns, such we really support our candidates to make the most of their research, and that is kind of a focus and also a call to action, I guess, for institutions to not focus so much only on the nitty-gritty of methodology, but how do those methodologies and how does that research really transform society more widely, and to take up the challenge of recognizing the things that we can do with our practices, and that it does more perhaps than we might generally consider it to do. So how does it really have a transformative effect, both in dance and in academia, but also to the world? Last slide, please. So just to thank you for listening. I know we're going to go on to questions, and I also sort of really welcome those questions. And if you want to get in touch with me afterwards, you've got some contacts there to do so. And I'd be really interested in your use of the ADIE resources and any thoughts or questions you have. That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vida. Such a rich presentation, so much to talk about. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions to start off, but just to say to the participants that if you want to ask questions, you can either type into the Q&A function, and Inesh will, after I've asked a few questions, Inesh will actually follow up with the questions, or you can also raise your hand if you would like to ask your question live, and you'll be able to then be heard through the audio, if you like. So I'll reiterate that later. But I'm going to start off with my first question, Vida. I mean, it is so rich and such a rich area, and so wonderful to hear about all of this. One of the things, I mean, that really did strike me, and one of my own questions is around this idea of decolonizing the curriculum and how we manage, like, our own processes, having gone through a kind of inculcation into academia as artists. And how we kind of are, you know, supervisors can bridge that space to somehow understand, you know, and try to preserve and support the kind of the thinking of the artist and the candidate coming in, and not crush that and kind of funnel it into too many different kind of directions, but also manage the complexities and tensions of the academic world, which are also real. And so one of the areas is around things like research training. And I wonder, would you mind maybe articulating a little bit further around that, and kind of insights you might have around managing that tension?
Yeah, I'd happy to, because it really is a tension. We have artists are entering the academy, and the real risk is, if we're not careful, that actually they become kind of models of the academy. And obviously one of the very rich challenges that artistic research can make is actually to change the academy rather than just to remodel it. And that obviously is one of the things that's really exciting about this work, but also the risk of entering. And we've certainly, the emphasis that is placed and the amount of effort it takes, for instance, to work out how to articulate your research in academic terms takes up so much energy. It can mean sometimes that the artistic processes and the voice of the practice itself is quite difficult to hear, and candidates find difficult to find space for if we're not really careful. So one of the things that certainly, I'll give you an example. I was just running a research intensive, so learning how to run a research intensive online. And one of the things that we did within that was set up groups of 3s. And what the candidates did was I invited them, rather than to present a presentation of their work in sort of using kind of language-based modalities, but was to share a fragment of practice or even their research materials. So that might have been something that they were watching or something they were drawing, whatever it might be. And we made creative responses to each other's work. So rather than getting ourselves constantly caught up within playing the kind of discourse game and sharing work within that kind of more traditional model of critique, but was actually to kind of make creative responses to each other's work and using that as a basis to engage with each other. So simple activities like that were really rich experiences, and give rise to unknowns. So, and also really value the practice at the centre, rather than feeling like actually the thing that's being valued is only my ability to articulate this thing. So that's kind of a short example of a way to set up different kinds of exchanges within a research training activity that just shifts the emphasis and keeps practice at the centre.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I remember actually, because Carol Brown was my supervisor, I remember one of the things that she did was actually encourage a studio practice. And we only did it a few times, but it was hugely meaningful to not only be dealing in the analytical and to be sitting at a desk, but actually to be in studio with other candidates was really important. And I want to just ask in relation to future then developments of this project, but also kind of a little bit the capacity for this to shift. You talked a little bit about the potential for this kind of artistic research to shift the academic environment. And you have any sense of where that might be, and is that something that you see coming out of this project, or is that another step?
I think it's part of a whole, we also see it coming out of social sciences and the shift towards a kind of what we might call the practice turn going on across other disciplines too. So we do have allies in that process. To think about, well, what does it mean to be able to think about how do we understand knowledge, how do we understand knowledge formation and how it's shared, and that through practice that we might be doing that with quite different audiences. And I think we recognise even in the framing of impact, which is in some ways highly problematic in its framing, but that there is already in that a shift towards thinking of not only what research does for other researchers, but how research operates with communities, with people, with policymakers, and makes a difference more widely. Now, without getting into the worries about how do we track and evidence that, let's not worry about that, but we certainly have the potential within artistic research doctorates to think about those communities and connections and partners and collaborators as people that we're on that journey with, to make a difference to the people we're working with and those that sort of see and engage in our processes. In terms of academia, I think we already see I was reflecting recently on, I'm just finishing up, having done the Choreographic Practices Journal for 10 years now, I'm just handing it over to some new editors. But one of the reflections from that was actually 10 years ago, to see different voices and different registers of writing within academically peer-reviewed journals was still quite unusual 10 years ago. Whereas actually now it's pretty commonplace. So that's already a shift that artistic researchers started to make in terms of what are the registers of writing, what kind of modalities is this research made evident and shared with the world. So we, you know, there's perhaps small inroads in one way, but they are making a difference.
Great, thank you so much. So listen, I'm going to hand over to postdoctoral researcher Inesh, who's going to moderate the questions from participants.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Vida. That was a really enriching presentation. I'll just like to let everyone know, if you have any questions, do put them into the Q&A, and I will be addressing those shortly. While we wait for them to come in, Vida, I would like to ask you a question too. So the recommendation that you propose that come out of the Artistic Doctorates in Europe project are very much centered around the dance field. I guess my question is whether you see those apply to artistic research candidates in general in other areas such as theater and music, and also whether you have seen some of the recommendations that you suggest already been applied in institutions that you might work with, and what outcomes, what happened. I'm quite keen to hear what has actually happened.
Yeah. So certainly many of them, I mean, whilst we in dance and indeed in artistic research might have a very particular emphasis towards embodied and creative engagements, clearly those ways of being and thinking about supervision as a creative activity is one that can be employed in any field. I know creativity is not something solely defined by the arts, and certainly not solely defined by dance within the arts. So thinking about how does thinking of supervision as a witnessing process, how does thinking of supervision, thinking about it as a mindful process, how do we think about those kind of transdisciplinary modes, whatever kind of engagement we're having and whatever discipline we're in, I think can make a real difference to the kind of exchanges, the kind of discussions, the kind of experience that supervisors have and candidates have through the research journey. So it's definitely, many of them are applicable to pretty much any field, although there might be language through which we talk about them in dance that is specific. In terms of your other question around seeing what some of those recommendations are being played out. So for example, one of the recommendations we make is about making connections to and building connections with professional dance organisations and arts organisations. And we've certainly seen that played out within the project itself and beyond, where by bringing professional organisations both into the supervisory process, but also by really helping those organisations understand what does it mean to support and present artistic research within their own professional programmes, for instance. What does it mean to think about supporting a researcher and to support research work to meet a public? Those debates have definitely made a difference to the work. So for example, in the Helsinki, we had one of our partners, Chiasma, one of the main gallery and theatre spaces in Helsinki, have now started a series of public events where researchers, artistic researchers, are sharing their work within those public gallery spaces. So we're making those kind of connections and reaching them beyond an academic audience to a public, and that really making a difference to the kind of exchange going on, to the kind of language that's used and the way the practice is shared.
Thank you. I have two questions from the audience. The first one is about examination, and you do talk in some of your writings about examination framework that values the practice in equal footing with the writing. And I guess I'm thinking, what would be the ideal examination framework? But this question is about how can we standardize examination in a way that the process is equitable and sound?
Yeah, so I mean, the examination is an interesting one because obviously in different countries, the way theses are examined is quite different. So for example, in Helsinki, the Uni Arts Helsinki, one of the partners in the Artistic Doctorate project, the candidates have to have all their practice examined and passed before they can go on to write the written component of the thesis. In Stockholm Uni Arts, they have 3 very clearly defined examination points for the practice. Whereas if you compare that to a lot of UK institutions, we have a much more open process where it's defined by the research itself, and it might be about, there might be regulations in the university of whether that practice can be examined. So for example, you know, do we have to wait till post-transfer for the work to be examined? Does it all have to come in at the end, or can there be examinations along the way? These things are very institution and country dependent. I think one of the core things that the recommendations suggest, though, is that we make sure in both the examining process that we are really clear in understanding, and that the practice itself is ideally, if it's supposed to be seen live. Interesting how we do that within, particularly through COVID, that's been particularly challenging. But there is there are cost implications and time implications for that that have to really be considered. And equally, that the examiners themselves feel that they have the ability within the examining process to really not only talk about the practice, but to think about what the practice is doing in relationship to the knowledge generation aim of the thesis. Often we see examiners, interestingly, not being willing to offer the same corrections, for want of a better term, to practice as they do to the written part of the thesis, if indeed there is a written part of the thesis. Many doctors of arts ones only have a very limited amount of writing in relationship to them. And I don't know as I'd want them necessarily to be standardized processes, but it's about a certain kind of level of awareness of the practice itself being in itself the knowledge-bearing element, being epistemic in nature, rather than being something that is only what we're examining is the writing about, rather than the thing itself. And examiners having the confidence to do that.
And could you tell us a little bit more about the relationship of the practice to the writing process, how the two come together in artistic research effectively?
Yeah. Now, I have very particular views on this, and doesn't have to be this way. So it is quite possible to do an artistic research degree where you have practice and you then write about it as almost even in the third person, as if it were an object. That is it is a model that is possible. It's not one I have generally encouraged in my own candidates, or I tend to think of them as very much a synergy, that the articulation of the practice and the practice are the same thing. They're just doing it in different modalities. So the practice and the writing are asking the same questions. They just find a different mode of articulation of sharing in the world. And that for me is really important, and finding how that works is something that I work extensively with my candidates on. But it's not the only model. That's a particular model I take.
Yes, and that seems to be quite tricky to achieve, because each project will achieve that differently, in my view.
Absolutely.
Finally, last question I have is whether you could give an example of a dissertation question or topic that has engaged with the community. That's one of the key recommendations of the project, and particularly engage with the community for the wider benefit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, there's so many to start with that one. And it's equally, of course, that it might be that the research process engages, even in a way that might be in itself not be the whole element of the research. So there are many ways that artistic research project can engage with a community in different ways. But in terms of reaching to those wider questions, I've recently had a candidate complete who was looking at It was actually a collaborative project with the dance agency Dance 4, who are based in Nottingham, Midlands, middle of England based organisation, who have a what's called the CAT scheme. It's a youth-based dance training scheme. And his research really was looking at how does their offer enhance the creativity of the young people engaging in it. And so the research both engaged with those young people and made a difference to their thinking about their training, as well as making a difference to a professional dance organisation and how they perceived their offer to make a difference. So it's kind of an interesting, that one was already co-funded by Dance4 as a professional organisation, so it was very much a collaborative PhD in the first place.
Okay, thank you very much, Vida. I think it's time for us to close, so I'm going to pass over back to Jenny for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines. And just to say thank you so much to Vida. It's such a rich presentation this morning and so much to look at and unpack, and also wonderful resources available to supervisors and candidates alike. And it's also just to say as well, I'm so delighted to see dance having such an impact on the field of artistic research. So thank you so much this morning. I'm going to pass you now on to Jules just to close. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thanks so much, Vida and Jenny, for this morning's session. Very rich. To repeat that from Jenny, that it's so exciting to have the broader research from the 3-year project that you've been involved with. And also just to say that it was because I was at Vida's final project in Helsinki last summer that I was really inspired to apply for the funding for this whole research project. So you've really been a pioneer for me and for this research project. So we really appreciate that. And thank you also, Jenny and Ines and Michael. So to close quickly, just to let everyone know that we've a busy week this week and we've another seminar on Thursday. And this is an important one because it's the end of this first section of our seminar series, in which we have a group panel from both UCC and Ireland more broadly, reflecting on these first 6 seminars, which have been discipline specific in our different fields of music, theatre, film and dance, and also having an overview from Gretchen Schiller about artistic research supports in France. So do join us on Thursday, the 13th this week at 11 AM for Ireland in Europe, Reflections and Resonance. And also to say that we have an open call at the moment for PhD candidates who would be interested in presenting as part of this seminar series in September. We'd very much welcome your application and your interest. Ines is going to share the link with you in the chat now. And that's on the 17th and on the 24th of September. And we have space for presentations from 6 different candidates. So we'd really welcome a kind of rich range of disciplines and subjects. So thank you all very much. And with that, I'll close the session. Thank you.